I watched through my kitchen window as the backhoe tore through my front yard, its massive bucket ripping into the earth like it owned the place. And for a sick moment, I realized nobody had bothered to tell me this was happening today. The machine was already 3 feet deep into what I knew was directly over my septic system's main line, operated by a guy who looked like he would rather be anywhere else on this muggy Tuesday morning in suburban Atlanta. My coffee mug hit the counter harder than I intended as I bolted for the front door, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Hey, stop! What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, running across my lawn in bare feet, the morning dew soaking through my socks instantly. The operator either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me because the backhoe kept digging, churning up red Georgia clay and something else, something that made my stomach drop. That sickly sweet smell hit me before I even registered what I was seeing. The operator finally noticed me waving my arms like a madman and shut off the engine. In the sudden silence, I could hear water. No, not water, gurgling up from the gash in my yard. "What are you doing on my property?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice level, even though every instinct screamed at me to completely lose it. The guy climbed down from his machine, looking defensive. "I'm with Reliable Excavation. We're contracted to install fiber optic cable for the whole neighborhood. Got the work order right here." He pulled a crumpled paper from his back pocket. "Did anyone think to maybe knock on my door first? Or check where my septic system is before you started digging?" I could smell it now, really smell it, and it was getting worse by the second. His face went pale as he looked back at the trench. "Oh, man. Is that—" "Yes, that's my septic system. You just tore right through the main line." I wanted to scream, to throw something, but I forced myself to breathe. "Who authorized this? Who gave you permission to dig on my property?" Before he could answer, I heard the click of heels on pavement. Sharon Mitchell, president of the Oakmont Hills Homeowners Association, was marching across the street toward us with that particular expression she wore when she thought she was about to educate someone beneath her station. Everything about Sharon screamed entitled suburban tyrant, from her asymmetrical blonde bob that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill to her pressed white capris that had never seen a day of actual work. "Mr. Walker, there's no need for all this commotion," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "The HOA approved this fiber installation 3 months ago. It was in the newsletter." "Harrison," I corrected automatically, though I'd told her a dozen times I went by my first name, not some formal mister. "And I don't care what was in the newsletter, Sharon. You can't just tear up someone's property without permission, and you definitely can't destroy their septic system." She waved a manicured hand dismissively. "The HOA has an easement for utility improvements. It's in the bylaws you agreed to when you purchased your home. This benefits the entire community. Harrison, surely you can see that faster internet is worth a little inconvenience." "A little inconvenience?" I gestured at the growing pool of sewage bubbling up from the broken pipe. "You destroyed my septic system. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost to repair?" Sharon's nose wrinkled as the smell reached her. She took a step back. "Well, that's unfortunate, but you'll need to contact your homeowner's insurance. The HOA can't be held responsible for pre-existing conditions with your septic system." "Pre-existing conditions? Your backhoe literally just smashed through it. I watched it happen." "The contractor assured us they would use ground-penetrating radar to locate all utilities," Sharon said, already pulling out her phone like this conversation was boring her. "If your septic system wasn't properly marked, that's not our problem. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call." She turned on her heel and started walking away while sewage was actively flooding my yard. The operator looked between us, clearly wanting no part of this situation. "You need to stop all work immediately," I called after her, "and you're going to pay to fix this." Sharon didn't even look back. "Read your bylaws, Mr. Walker. Section 12, paragraph 4. The HOA is not liable for incidental damage during approved improvement projects. Have a blessed day." I stood there, sewage water creeping closer to my feet, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just going to be about getting my septic system fixed. This was going to be war. The excavation guy was already on his phone, probably calling his supervisor. I went back inside, my socks squishing with each step, and grabbed my own phone. First call was to a septic company. Second call was going to be to a lawyer, because I knew exactly how this was going to play out if I didn't get ahead of it. Mike's septic service arrived within 2 hours, which was faster than I'd hoped. Mike himself was a grizzled guy in his 50s who'd seen everything, but even he whistled low when he saw the damage. "That's a clean break right through your main line," he said, crouching by the trench. "Whoever was operating that backhoe went right through it. You're looking at a full replacement of at least 40 feet of pipe, probably more. Going to have to excavate the whole run to make sure there's no collapse further down." "How much?" I asked, even though I didn't want to know. Mike sucked air through his teeth. "Parts and labor? You're looking at 15 to 20,000 minimum, maybe more once we get in there and see the full extent. That's assuming your tank itself isn't damaged. If it is, we're talking another 10 grand easy." My knees felt weak. I'd bought this house in Oakmont Hills 2 years ago, stretching my budget as a software contractor to afford what the realtor had called an up-and-coming neighborhood with excellent amenities. The HOA fees were steep at $300 a month, but Sharon and her board had promised they maintained everything beautifully. Now I was looking at potentially $30,000 in repairs for something that wasn't even my fault. "Can you document everything?" I asked. "Take pictures, write up a detailed report of what caused this?" Mike nodded slowly. "You're going to sue somebody, aren't you?" "Thinking about it." "Good, because this didn't happen on its own. Someone dug where they shouldn't have without checking first. You want me to write up what I see?" "Please. Be as detailed as possible." While Mike worked, I called my home insurance company. The claims adjuster was sympathetic but delivered the news I'd been dreading. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker, but your policy specifically excludes damage caused by construction or excavation by third parties. That's considered a liability issue for whoever did the digging. You'll need to pursue compensation from them directly." "Even though it's on my property?" "Even then. If the HOA authorized the work, they would be the liable party. You could also pursue the excavation company if they were negligent. But your homeowner's policy won't cover this type of damage." I thanked her and hung up, feeling that cold sensation in my chest spread. Sharon had known exactly what she was talking about. She'd probably dealt with situations like this before, probably steamrolled right over other homeowners who didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight back. But I'd spent the last decade working in tech, navigating corporate politics and contract negotiations. I knew how to read fine print, and I definitely knew when someone was trying to screw me over. If Sharon thought I was going to roll over and pay 30 grand out of pocket for her precious fiber optic installation, she had severely underestimated me. My next call was to Thomas and Associates, a law firm in Marietta that specialized in property disputes. I got through to a junior associate named David Chen, who listened to my story with growing interest. "Do you have documentation of the damage?" he asked. "I'm getting a full report from the septic company right now. I also have photos and video from my phone. The trench is still open, and you can see exactly where the backhoe broke through the pipe." "And the HOA claims they have an easement for this work?" "That's what the president said. Something about Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the bylaws," I heard typing on the other end. "I'll need to see your HOA bylaws and the specific work order that was issued. Can you get me those documents?" "I'll have to request them from the HOA." "Do that immediately. Also, don't let them fill in that trench or do any repairs without documenting everything first. We'll need to potentially have our own engineer assess the damage. The septic guy said I'm looking at 15 to 30,000 in repairs." "That's actually good in a weird way," David said. "Georgia courts take property damage seriously, especially when it involves health and safety issues like sewage. If we can prove negligence or that the HOA exceeded their authority, we can recover not just repair costs, but potentially additional damages." "What are my chances here?" David was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, HOAs have a lot of power and they usually have pretty airtight bylaws that protect them. But there are limits. They can't just destroy someone's property without proper notification and due process. The fact that you weren't even informed this was happening today works in your favor. Let me review those documents and I'll give you a better assessment." We scheduled a meeting for the next day. When I hung up, Mike was finishing his preliminary inspection. "It's worse than I thought," he said, showing me his tablet with photos of the damage. "The impact didn't just break the main line. It cracked your distribution box, and there's evidence of collapse in the lateral field lines. This is going to be a complete system replacement." "How much?" I asked, my voice hollow. $35,000, maybe $40 by the time we're done. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. $40,000. I had maybe $5,000 in my emergency fund. The rest would have to go on credit cards or a loan, and all because Sharon Mitchell and her HOA board decided they needed faster internet speeds. Start documenting everything, I told Mike. I need ammunition. Over the next week, my life became a waking nightmare. The sewage backup meant I couldn't use any water in the house without it flooding my yard. I had to shut off the main valve and live like I was camping, showering at the gym and using restaurant bathrooms. The smell from my yard was ungodly, and I could see my neighbors avoiding eye contact when they drove past. Sharon, meanwhile, had sent me a certified letter that arrived 3 days after the incident. It was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive corporate speak, expressing the HOA's regret about the unfortunate situation while firmly denying any liability. It cited Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the bylaws, which stated that the HOA was not responsible for incidental or consequential damage resulting from approved community improvement projects. But I'd done my homework. I'd read through the entire 70-page bylaws document, and what Sharon had conveniently left out was Section 7, Paragraph 2, which required the HOA to provide reasonable notice and opportunity for homeowners to protect their property before any major construction on or near their lots. I'd received no such notice. The newsletter mention she'd cited was buried in the back page under Future Projects, with no specific timeline or property details. I brought all of this to my meeting with David Chen and his senior partner, Margaret Thomas. Margaret was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 50s who'd made her name going after negligent contractors and predatory HOAs. "This is good," Margaret said, spreading out the documents across her conference table. "This is very good. They violated their own bylaws by not giving you proper notice. That opens them up to liability regardless of the easement clause." "Can we win this?" I asked. "I think we can. But I need to be honest with you, Harrison. Litigation is expensive and time-consuming. HOAs have deep pockets and they fight dirty. They'll drag this out, try to exhaust your resources, maybe even put a lien on your property if you stop paying dues. What's my alternative? Pay $40,000 for damage they caused? You could try to negotiate with them directly. Demand they cover the repairs, threaten litigation if they refuse. Sometimes that's enough to make them settle." "You don't know Sharon Mitchell," I said bitterly. "She'd rather burn money fighting me than admit the HOA did anything wrong." Margaret nodded. "Then we sue. I'll draft a demand letter first, give them 30 days to respond. If they refuse, we file in Cobb County Superior Court. We'll go for full damages plus attorney fees, court costs, and compensation for your loss of use of the property." "How much are we talking total? With everything? You could be looking at 70,000 if we win. And I think we will win. This is pretty clear-cut negligence. I signed the retainer agreement that day. Margaret's firm would work on contingency, taking 30% of whatever we recovered. If we lost, I'd only be out the filing fees and costs, but I'd still be stuck with the $40,000 repair bill." The demand letter went out 2 days later. It was 10 pages of legal precision, laying out exactly how the HOA had violated its own bylaws, failed to exercise due diligence, and caused extensive damage to my property. It demanded payment of $42,000, the updated estimate from Mike's Septic Service, within 30 days. Sharon's response came in 24 hours. It was 2 sentences. "The HOA denies all liability in this matter. Any further communication should be directed to our legal counsel." "That was fast," David commented when I forwarded him the email. "They're not even trying to negotiate." "What does that mean?" "It means they think they can win, or they're too arrogant to take you seriously. Either way, we file the lawsuit." The complaint was filed with Cobb County Superior Court on a humid Friday morning in June. I'd lived with a non-functioning septic system for 3 weeks at that point, spending my nights at cheap motels when I couldn't stand another gym shower, burning through my savings at an alarming rate. The lawsuit named the Oakmont Hills Homeowners Association, Sharon Mitchell in her capacity as president, and Reliable Excavation Company as defendants. We were seeking compensatory damages of $42,000 plus $15,000 in consequential damages for loss of use of property plus attorney fees and court costs. I knew the moment the HOA board found out because my email exploded with messages. Sharon sent an official notice stating that I was in violation of community standards for having an unsightly worksite on my property and was being fined $200 per day until it was resolved. Another board member, a man named Richard Kowalski, who I'd barely spoken to, sent a thinly veiled thread about residents who don't work with the HOA finding themselves very uncomfortable in the neighborhood. But the worst was the social media pile-on. Oakmont Hills had a private Facebook group where neighbors discussed everything from lost pets to landscaping recommendations. Someone, probably Sharon, had posted about the lawsuit, painting me as a troublemaker trying to shake down the HOA for money that would come out of everyone's dues. "Can you believe Harrison Walker is suing US?" the post read. "The fiber installation was approved by a majority vote last year. He just wants a free ride to fix his old failing septic system. This is why our dues keep going up." The comments were brutal. Neighbors I'd waved to for 2 years were calling me greedy, selfish, a freeloader. A few people defended me, pointing out that I hadn't been properly notified and that the damage was clearly caused by the excavation, but they were drowned out by the mob mentality Sharon had whipped up. I stopped checking the Facebook group after the first day. It was too depressing to see how quickly people turned when fed a narrative by someone in authority. Discovery phase began in July. Margaret and David requested all documentation related to the fiber installation project, including the initial approval, contractor selection, survey maps, and any ground-penetrating radar reports. The HOA's attorney, a slick corporate type named Brett Palmer from a big Atlanta firm, fought us on every request, claiming most of it was privileged or irrelevant. But judges don't like it when one party stonewalls discovery, especially in a straightforward property damage case. Judge Patricia Reynolds, assigned to our case, ordered the HOA to produce the documents within 2 weeks or face sanctions. What we got was enlightening. The ground-penetrating radar survey that Sharon had mentioned to me that first day. It never happened. The HOA board had voted to skip that expense to save money, despite the excavation company recommending it. The fiber installation was approved based on outdated property maps that didn't show individual septic systems, just estimated locations. Even better, the meeting minutes from the board sessions showed that Sharon had personally pushed to skip proper notification to residents, arguing it would cause unnecessary drama and delays. Another board member had objected, citing the bylaw's requirement for notice, but Sharon had overruled them. "This is gold," Margaret said, spreading out the documents in her office. "They knew they were supposed to notify you. They chose not to because Sharon didn't want to deal with pushback. That's willful negligence, maybe even reckless disregard." "Can we add punitive damages?" I asked. "We can amend the complaint. With this evidence, we have a strong argument for it." The amended complaint went out in August, now seeking $75,000 in total damages. Brett Palmer hit the roof, firing off angry emails about how we were trying to shake down a volunteer organization for excessive damages. But Margaret was unmoved. "Your client destroyed my client's septic system through negligence and willful disregard for proper procedures," she wrote back. "If anything, we're being conservative in our demands. Take it to trial if you want." They didn't want to go to trial. Brett Palmer called Margaret in early September with a settlement offer, $20,000 and no admission of wrongdoing. "That's not even half the repair costs," I said when Margaret told me. "I know," I told him no, "but it means they're worried. They wouldn't be offering anything if they thought they could win. What do? We keep pushing. Depositions start next week." The depositions were fascinating in the most infuriating way possible. Sharon Mitchell sat across from Margaret in a conference room, perfectly coiffed and dressed like she was going to a country club luncheon, and proceeded to lie her face off. "I was not aware that Mr. Walker's property would be affected by the excavation," she claimed under oath. "The contractor assured the board that all utilities would be located properly." Margaret slid a copy of the meeting minutes across the table. "These notes from the March board meeting show you personally voted against conducting a ground-penetrating radar survey. You stated, and I quote, 'We need to cut costs where we can, and the contractor has experience with this kind of work.' Do you recall saying that?" Sharon barely glanced at the document. I may have said something like that, but the contractor still assured us they would be careful. Did you personally notify any residents along the fiber installation route about the construction timeline? We sent out a newsletter. That's not what I asked. Did you personally notify anyone? The newsletter was the notification. According to the bylaws, residents are entitled to specific notice of any construction that might affect their property. A general newsletter mention doesn't satisfy that requirement, does it? Sharon's attorney jumped in. That's a legal conclusion. She doesn't have to answer that, Margaret smiled. I'll rephrase. Did you believe that mentioning the fiber installation in a newsletter with no specific dates or property impact analysis satisfied the notification requirements in Section 7, Paragraph 2 of the HOAWS? I believed we had followed proper procedures, Sharon said stiffly. The deposition went on for 4 hours. By the end, Sharon was visibly rattled, her makeup starting to crack under the conference room lights. Margaret had walked her through every decision, every corner cut, every place where the HOA board had chosen expediency over proper procedure. The other board members' depositions were even worse for the HOA. Richard Kowalski admitted he'd objected to skipping the radar survey, but had been outvoted. The treasurer, a nervous woman named Linda Chen, revealed that the board had specifically allocated $40,000 in the budget for potential property remediation related to the fiber installation, which suggested they'd known damage was likely. They knew, I said to Margaret after reading the deposition transcripts. They built in a budget for fixing damage they caused, but when it actually happened, they denied responsibility. Juries love this kind of thing, Margaret said. Shows consciousness of guilt. They knew they might cause damage, planned for it financially, but then tried to stick individual homeowners with the bill. It's exactly the kind of HOA overreach that makes people angry. Brett Palmer called with a new offer in October. $35,000, still no admission of wrongdoing. Plus, they'd dropped the fines they'd been levying against me for the unsightly work site. We're getting closer, Margaret said, but I think we can do better. The trial date is set for January. They don't want this going in front of a jury. She was right. 2 weeks later, Brett called again. $42,000 covering my full repair costs. I would need to sign an NDA and agree not to discuss the settlement. No, I said immediately when Margaret presented the offer. I'm not signing an NDA. Other people need to know what happened here. Harrison, that's a lot of money to walk away from on principle. It's not about principle. Well, not just principle. If I sign an NDA, Sharon gets to keep spinning whatever narrative she wants. Other homeowners won't know what the board did. They'll keep pulling this kind of thing. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You know, in 15 years of practice, I don't think I've ever had a client turn down a settlement for that reason. They almost always take the money and run. Is that a criticism? No, it's actually kind of refreshing. Okay, we tell them no deal with an NDA. Let's see if they blink. They blinked. The final settlement offer came in November, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. $45,000, no NDA, and a written admission that the HOA had failed to follow proper notification procedures in the fiber installation project. They also agreed to revise their bylaws to require specific written notice to affected homeowners before any future construction projects, and to always conduct proper utility surveys before excavation. This is a good deal, Margaret said. You're getting more than your repair costs, you're getting an admission of fault, and you're getting actual policy changes that will protect other homeowners. I think you should take it. I sat in Margaret's office, looking at the settlement agreement, thinking about the last 6 months of hell. The sleepless nights, the gym showers, the motel rooms, the stress of knowing I was fighting people who were supposed to be my neighbors. The way Sharon Mitchell had looked through me like I was nothing, like my home and my property and my rights were just inconveniences to be swept aside. What happens to Sharon? I asked. Margaret shrugged. That's internal HOA politics. The settlement doesn't require any personnel changes. So she just gets away with it. She's being forced to admit fault and change policies. That's something. It's not enough. Harrison, you can't destroy someone just because they wronged you. That's not how this works. I knew she was right, but it still felt hollow. I signed the settlement agreement. The check arrived 2 weeks later. $45,000, drawn on the Oakmont Hills HOA operating account. I deposited it immediately and called Mike's septic service. "You ready to do this?" I asked. "Been ready since June," Mike said. "Let's get your system fixed." The repair took 3 weeks. Mike and his crew excavated the entire septic system, replacing pipes, the distribution box, and large sections of the lateral field. It was extensive, invasive, and incredibly expensive. The final bill came to $41,000. With the legal fees covered by the settlement, I actually came out a few thousand ahead. But the money wasn't really the point. Not anymore. The settlement agreement was a matter of public record, which meant anyone could look it up if they knew where to search. I made sure to email a copy to every homeowner in Oakmont Hills, along with a detailed timeline of what had happened and how the HOA board had tried to dodge responsibility. The response was immediate and volcanic. Homeowners who'd believed Sharon's narrative suddenly had documentary proof that the HOA had screwed up, tried to cover it up, and then spent tens of thousands of their dues fighting a lawsuit they ultimately lost. People were furious. An emergency HOA meeting was called in December. I attended, sitting in the back of the community center while 200 angry homeowners packed the room. Sharon tried to call the meeting to order, but she was drowned out by shouting, "You cost us $45,000 because you couldn't follow your own rules. How much did we pay that fancy lawyer to fight Harrison? That's our money. You should resign." Sharon's face was bright red, her voice shrill as she tried to maintain control. "If we could just have order, please. This matter has been resolved through proper legal channels. The board stands behind our decisions, which were made in good faith to benefit the community." "Good faith?" someone yelled. "You destroyed his septic system and tried to make him pay for it." "The settlement agreement included no admission of wrongdoing," Sharon said, technically truthful, but practically meaningless given what else was in the document. I stood up. Every head in the room turned toward me. "That's so." "That's not entirely accurate," I said, my voice carrying across the sudden silence. "The settlement specifically states that the HOA failed to follow proper notification procedures. That's an admission that you didn't do your job correctly. The only reason it doesn't say more is because your lawyer negotiated it down to the bare minimum." Sharon's eyes were daggers. "Mr. Walker, you're out of order. I'm a homeowner in good standing, and this is a homeowners meeting. I have every right to speak. Your lawsuit has cost this community tens of thousands of dollars. My lawsuit wouldn't have been necessary if you'd just followed your own bylaws. If you'd notified me about the construction, I could have marked my septic system. If you'd paid for a proper survey like you were supposed to, the excavation company would have known where to avoid. But you cut corners to save money, and when it blew up in your face, you tried to blame me for it." The room erupted in applause. Not everyone. Some people still glared at me like I was the villain here, but enough that Sharon looked genuinely shaken. Richard Kowalski, who'd been sitting quietly at the board table, stood up. "I'd like to make a motion for a vote of no confidence in the current board president." "Seconded," multiple voices called out. Sharon tried to shut it down, claiming it wasn't on the agenda, but the meeting had taken on a life of its own. Margaret had warned me this might happen, that public exposure of HOA misconduct often led to board shakeups. These were volunteer positions after all. Nobody could be forced to stay. The vote wasn't even close. Sharon Mitchell was removed as HOA president by a margin of 73%. Richard Kowalski was elected interim president with a mandate to clean up the board's procedures and restore accountability. Sharon stormed out of the meeting without a word, her heels clicking furiously on the linoleum. I never spoke to her again. Life returned to something like normal in the new year. My septic system worked perfectly, a fact I appreciated every single day after months of dysfunction. The massive scar across my front yard gradually healed as grass grew back over the excavation site. You could still see where the work had been done, a slightly different shade of green, but it would fade with time. The HOA, under Richard's leadership, actually became functional. He instituted new transparency measures, requiring board meetings to be recorded and posted online, financial reports to be distributed quarterly, and any construction projects to be thoroughly vetted with affected homeowners before work began. It was what the HOA should have been all along. I still got the occasional dirty look from neighbors who thought I'd been too harsh on Sharon, that I'd cost the community too much money over a simple mistake. But most people seemed to understand that it hadn't been a simple mistake. It had been negligence, arrogance, and a refusal to take responsibility. Those were the qualities that destroyed trust in any organization, HOA or otherwise. The real validation came 6 months after the settlement when I received a thank you card from a homeowner 3 streets over. The HOA had wanted to install new streetlights along his property line, and under the old regime, they would have just done it without consulting him. Under the new bylaws I'd forced them to adopt, they had to notify him, show him the plans, and give him a chance to voice concerns about placement. They'd ended up moving the lights 15 feet to avoid shading his garden, a small change that meant everything to him. "You made them remember they work for us, not the other way around," the card read. "Thank you for standing up when it mattered." That made it all worthwhile. The stress, the money, the months of fighting, all of it led to a system that was slightly better, slightly more just. Not perfect, not even close, but better than it had been. I kept the settlement check stub pinned to my home office corkboard, a reminder that sometimes standing up to bullies actually worked. That when someone with power tried to push you around, tried to make you accept responsibility for their mistakes, you could fight back. It wasn't easy, it wasn't cheap, and it sure as hell wasn't fun, but it was possible. Sharon Mitchell moved out of Oakmont Hills in March. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd taken a position on another HOA board in Alpharetta, somewhere she could start fresh without the baggage of her failures here. Part of me wanted to warn that community about what they were getting into, but Margaret advised against it. The settlement didn't prohibit me from discussing what happened, but actively following Sharon around to trash her reputation could open me up to harassment or defamation claims. "Let her make her own mistakes somewhere else," Margaret said. "You've done your part here." She was right, but it still bothered me that Sharon faced no real consequences beyond losing a volunteer position she'd clearly enjoyed abusing. The system wasn't set up to punish people like her, people who wielded small amounts of power with zero accountability. The best you could do was limit the damage and move on. I focused on moving on. Spring brought new landscaping, flowers, and shrubs to help disguise the construction scarring in my yard. I hired a lawn service, something I'd always been too cheap to consider before, figuring I'd earned the right to let someone else worry about the mowing for a while. The guy they sent out, a young Latino man named Jesus, did a fantastic job and started telling me about his dreams of starting his own landscaping company. "You should do it," I encouraged him. "Be your own boss, call your own shots." "My wife, she worries it's too risky. What if we fail?" "What if you succeed? You're good at this. People will pay for quality work." He seemed to take that to heart because 3 months later, he showed up with his own truck and company logo, Jesus's Professional Landscaping. I became his first regular client, and I made sure to recommend him to every neighbor who mentioned needing yard work. Small kindnesses, paying forward the support I'd received. The fiber optic internet that had caused so much trouble did eventually get activated. The speeds were impressive, I had to admit. My work calls were clearer, file transfers faster, streaming smoother. If the HOA had just followed proper procedures, if Sharon had just treated homeowners with basic respect, everyone could have enjoyed these benefits without the drama, expense, and destroyed relationships. That was the real tragedy of bad leadership. The underlying goal had been fine. The execution had been disastrous. I stayed active in HOA meetings, not because I enjoyed them, but because someone needed to keep watching. Richard did a good job, but he was just one person, and organizational culture didn't change overnight. There were still board members who thought homeowners should just trust the board and not ask questions, who bristled at the new transparency requirements, who saw accountability measures as burdensome red tape rather than necessary safeguards. At a meeting in June, one of those members, a woman named Patricia who'd been on the board for years, complained about the new notification requirements. "We're spending so much time and money on certified letters for every little thing. It's excessive." "You know it's excessive?" I said from my usual spot in the back. $45,000 settlements because you didn't bother to notify someone before digging up their property. The certified letters are cheap insurance against that. Patricia glared at me, but didn't have a comeback. Nobody did, because the numbers spoke for themselves. The settlement had been drawn from the HOA's reserve fund, money that was supposed to be saved for emergencies and major repairs. Now the community was behind on planned maintenance projects because of Sharon's arrogance. Every homeowner could see the consequences in the delayed pool renovations and the postponed street repaving. That was the hidden cost of bad governance. It wasn't just the money paid out in settlements, though that was significant. It was the erosion of trust, the delay of beneficial projects, the energy wasted on infighting that could have been spent on actual improvements. Sharon's legacy was a community that was poorer, more divided, and less functional than it should have been. But slowly, painfully, that began to heal. Richard's steady leadership and the new bylaws meant mistakes were caught earlier, decisions were made more transparently, and homeowners actually felt heard. The Facebook group, once a toxic cesspool of accusations, became something closer to an actual community forum where people shared recommendations and helped each other out. I even got an apology from one of the neighbors who'd piled on during the lawsuit drama. She stopped me while I was checking my mail one evening and said, awkwardly, that she'd believed Sharon's version without checking the facts and felt terrible about the comments she'd made. "I just assumed you were being greedy," she admitted. "But then I saw the actual settlement documents and realized the HOA really did screw up. I'm sorry for what I said about you online." "Thank you," I said, genuinely touched. "That takes courage to admit. You did the right thing, fighting them, even though it was expensive and hard. Someone needed to." These moments of connection, of people acknowledging they'd been wrong, meant more than the money ever could. They suggested that the community was learning, growing, becoming something better than it had been. Not that everything was sunshine and roses. There were still problems, still conflicts over parking spaces and noise complaints and people who let their dogs poop on other people's lawns. The HOA remained an imperfect organization run by imperfect people trying to manage an inherently unmanageable task of making hundreds of households with different priorities somehow function as a cohesive unit. But at least now there were rules that meant something, accountability that mattered, and a memory of what happened when those things were ignored. My destroyed septic system had become a kind of community legend, a cautionary tale about the importance of proper procedure and respectful communication. New board members were specifically told about the lawsuit during their orientation, not to scare them, but to emphasize why the bylaws existed and why they couldn't be treated as suggestions. I ran into Brett Palmer, the HOA's lawyer, at a restaurant in Marietta about a year after the settlement. He was with his family, enjoying what looked like a birthday dinner for his teenage daughter. He saw me, did a double take, then came over to my table. "Harrison Walker, right?" he said, extending his hand. I shook it cautiously. "That's me." "I just wanted to say that was a hell of a case. You fought hard and you won. Not many people have the spine to go toe-to-toe with their HOA like that." "Your client didn't make it easy," he laughed ruefully. "No, they didn't. Between you and me, Sharon Mitchell was the worst client I've ever represented. Arrogant, dismissive of legal advice, absolutely convinced she couldn't lose. I told her to settle early, offered to negotiate a reasonable deal, but she insisted on fighting it out of sheer stubbornness." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm glad you won. Not every case I take is one I believe in, but I do my job regardless. This one, though. Your lawyer did great work and you deserved that settlement. The HOA needed to learn a lesson." "Did they?" "Seems like it. I haven't gotten any calls from Oakmont Hills since the settlement. Usually, problem HOAs are repeat customers. Radio silence means they're probably actually following their bylaws now." He went back to his family dinner, and I sat there thinking about the strange ways justice worked. Brett had argued against me, fought to minimize what I received, done everything in his professional power to make me lose. But he'd been doing a job, and underneath the courtroom adversary was someone who apparently understood right from wrong. It was a weirdly humanizing moment. The second anniversary of the septic system disaster came and went without fanfare. My yard was fully healed, grass lush and green with no sign of the destruction that had happened there. The fiber internet hummed along flawlessly, delivering the speeds that had justified the whole project in Sharon's mind. And I had a bank account that was healthier than expected, the leftover settlement money providing a nice cushion for the first time in years. More importantly, I had proof that the system could work if you pushed it hard enough, that HOAs, despite their power and their legal protections, weren't invincible. that ordinary homeowners with legitimate grievances could fight back and win if they were willing to endure the stress and expense of the battle. I thought about that thank you card I'd received, the one from the neighbor who'd benefited from the revised bylaws. How many future conflicts had been prevented by the changes forced through my lawsuit? How many homeowners would be properly notified, consulted, and respected because Sharon's shortcut approach had been officially rejected? The ripple effects of standing up to abuse of power were impossible to fully calculate, but they were real. That was the story I told when new neighbors moved in and asked about the slightly different colored grass in my front yard. Not a story about revenge or money, but about the importance of accountability and the surprising power of documentation and persistence. Some of them looked at me like I was crazy for taking on the HOA. Others nodded thoughtfully, filing away the lesson for if they ever needed it themselves. The neighborhood continued to evolve. New families moved in, attracted by the good schools and reasonable home prices. They had no memory of Sharon Mitchell or the lawsuit, knew nothing about the settlement or the bylaw changes. For them, Oakmont Hills was just a neighborhood with an HOA that seemed to run relatively smoothly, that communicated clearly and treated homeowners with basic respect. They had no idea how much work had gone into making that true. And honestly, that was fine. The goal had never been recognition or credit. It had been getting my septic system fixed and making sure the same thing didn't happen to someone else. On quiet evenings, sitting on my back porch with a beer and watching the sunset over the Georgia pines, I sometimes thought about alternate timelines. What if I'd just paid for the repairs myself? Taken out a loan, fixed the problem, moved on with my life. It would have been easier in the short term, less stressful, less time-consuming. No lawsuit, no depositions, no angry Facebook comments or neighborhood drama. But Sharon would still be HOA president, still cutting corners and bulldozing over anyone who objected. The bylaws would still be vague and toothless. The next homeowner who got screwed would have no recourse, no precedent, no proof that fighting back could work. So no, I didn't regret it. Not the sleepless nights or the gym showers or the months of uncertainty. Every bit of temporary misery had been worth creating something permanent and positive, a framework that protected people even if they never knew it had been necessary. The excavation company, Reliable Excavation, went out of business about 18 months after the lawsuit. I didn't know if the settlement played a role in that, but their online reviews had taken a beating once word got out about the septic system destruction. Contractors lived and died by reputation, and theirs had taken a hit they apparently couldn't recover from. The operator who'd been running the backhoe that day, the guy who'd looked so uncomfortable when I'd confronted him, sent me a LinkedIn message out of the blue. He'd moved to a different company and wanted to apologize for his role in what happened. I knew something felt wrong that morning, he wrote. The site maps were crap and my foreman was rushing us. I should have pushed back harder, made them get a proper survey. I'm sorry your property got damaged because we were careless. I appreciated the message more than he probably realized. It confirmed what I'd suspected, that the workers on the ground had known the project was being handled badly, but didn't have the power or authority to stop it. The failure had been at the management level, with Sharon and the HOA board prioritizing speed and cost savings over doing things correctly. No hard feelings, I wrote back. You were just doing your job. The people who should have known better were the ones making the decisions. I meant it too. The operator was a working guy trying to pay his bills, not a power-hungry HOA president. Holding him responsible would have been like blaming a hammer for hitting the wrong nail when the carpenter aimed badly. These were the complexities that didn't fit neatly into the lawsuit narrative. The excavation company had been negligent, yes, but they'd been working from bad information provided by a client who'd skipped necessary precautions. Sharon had been arrogant and dismissive, yes, but she'd also been a volunteer trying to manage a thankless job with limited resources. The whole situation was a cascade of small failures that snowballed into major damage, and parsing out exact percentages of blame was probably impossible. But that's what courts were for, cutting through the complexity to assign responsibility in a clear, enforceable way. The HOA had been legally liable, they'd paid damages, policies had changed, justice had been served even if it wasn't perfect or comprehensive. I started getting calls from other homeowners around Atlanta, people who'd heard about my case and were dealing with their own HOA nightmares. I wasn't a lawyer and couldn't give legal advice, but I listened to their stories and referred them to Margaret's firm when appropriate. Some of their situations were even worse than mine. HO, as that threatened daily fines for minor violations, that foreclosed on homes over unpaid dues, that seemed to exist solely to make residents' lives miserable. The problem, Margaret explained to me over lunch one day, is that HOAs have enormous power but minimal oversight. They can fine you, put liens on your property, even foreclose in extreme cases. But they're private organizations not subject to the same transparency requirements as government entities. It's a recipe for abuse. So what's the solution? State legislatures need to reform HOA laws, add protections for homeowners, create meaningful accountability mechanisms. But that requires political will, and most legislators don't care about HOA issues. They're seen as minor neighborhood squabbles, not serious policy problems. Even though they affect millions of people? Even though your case helped because it was clear-cut and you had resources to fight. Most people don't. They just suffer in silence or move out when it gets bad enough. It was a depressing realization. My victory, real as it was, represented a tiny fraction of HOA abuse cases. Most people didn't have the time, money, or knowledge to fight back effectively. They just absorbed the injustice and tried to survive it. But I could share what I'd learned. I started a blog documenting my experience, walking through every step from the initial damage to the final settlement. I explained how I'd found a good lawyer, what documentation had been crucial, which legal arguments had worked, and how much everything had cost. The blog wasn't fancy, just a basic WordPress site, but it got thousands of views from people desperate for information about fighting their HOAs. Some of them followed my playbook and won their own cases. I'd get emails with subject lines like, "Thank you, HOA settled," that detailed victories over unreasonable fines or unauthorized work on properties. Each one felt like vindication, proof that sharing information could multiply the impact of a single lawsuit. Not everyone won, of course. Some people had weaker cases or HOAs with better lawyers or just bad luck with judges. But even when they lost, at least they'd fought. At least they'd made the HOA work for it, spend resources, justify their actions in court. That mattered too, creating friction that made future abuse less appealing. The blog also attracted attention from HOA reform advocates, people who'd been fighting for legislative changes for years. They invited me to speak at meetings, share my story with lawmakers, provide a concrete example of why reforms were needed. I was hesitant at first. Public speaking wasn't my strength. But Margaret encouraged me to do it. "You have credibility because you won," she said. "You're not just complaining about HOAs, you have proof that they can cause real damage and avoid accountability. Legislators need to hear that from actual constituents, not just advocacy groups." So I spoke at a Georgia House subcommittee hearing on property rights, telling my story to a room full of representatives who mostly looked bored until I got to the part about $45,000 in damages. Money got their attention in a way that abstract principles didn't. This wasn't a dispute over lawn decorations or paint colors, I told them. This was an HOA that destroyed functional infrastructure on my property through negligence, then tried to use legal technicalities to avoid paying for repairs. Without the resources to hire good lawyers, I would have been stuck with that bill. Most homeowners are. A representative from Cherokee County, a woman named Elizabeth Hartford, asked me to elaborate on what legal reforms would have helped. "Mandatory insurance for HOAs that covers property damage caused by their projects," I said, reading from notes Margaret had helped me prepare. "Required notification procedures with teeth, meaning fines for boards that skip proper notice, and easier access to dispute resolution, maybe a streamlined small claims process specifically for HOA conflicts." "Wouldn't that just encourage frivolous lawsuits?" another representative asked skeptically. "What's frivolous about wanting your destroyed septic system repaired? The current system already has plenty of barriers to litigation. It's expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. If anything, we need to lower those barriers so HOAs know they can't get away with negligence." The subcommittee didn't pass any reforms that session, or the next one, or the one after that. But the conversation had started, and that was something. Seeds planted that might eventually grow into actual policy changes. Meanwhile, life went on in Oakmont Hills. The HOA under Richard's leadership continued to function well, managing the boring but necessary work of maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and handling the inevitable conflicts that arose in any neighborhood. It was what HOAs were supposed to be, administrative bodies that served residents rather than ruled over them. I even joined the Architectural Review Committee, the group that approved exterior home modifications. It seemed ironic given my history with the HOA, but I figured someone who'd been on the receiving end of arbitrary decisions should be involved in making fair ones. The committee work was tedious, reviewing applications for fence installations and roof replacements and paint color changes. But it was also important. Done right, it preserved property values and neighborhood aesthetics without being needlessly restrictive. Done wrong, it became a petty fiefdom where personal preferences masqueraded as community standards. I tried to be the voice of reasonableness, asking applicants what they were trying to accomplish and finding ways to approve requests rather than reflexively denying them. Not everyone on the committee shared that philosophy. There were still people who seemed to enjoy saying no, but I like to think I made a difference on the margins. 3 years after the settlement, I sold my house in Oakmont Hills. Not because of lingering bad feelings about the HOA, but because I'd gotten a job offer in Austin that was too good to pass up. The real estate market was strong, and my house sold in 4 days to a young couple with a toddler and another kid on the way. During the closing, the husband asked me about the HOA, whether they were reasonable or a nightmare. I thought about how to answer that. "They're fine now," I said finally. "They weren't always, but some things changed a few years back that made them more accountable. Just read your bylaws carefully and don't assume the board can do whatever they want. If something feels wrong, ask questions." That's weirdly specific advice. I learned it the hard way. You can read about it online if you're curious. Search for my name in Oakmont Hills. But the short version is that HOAs have a lot of power and you need to understand your rights as a homeowner. He pulled out his phone right there in the title company office and Googled me. His eyes got wide as he read the blog posts and news articles about the lawsuit. "Holy crap, they destroyed your septic system?" "They did, and they paid to fix it. The current board is much better, but stay vigilant." His wife, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel, looked at me with newfound respect. "You sued them and won? That's amazing. Most people wouldn't have the guts." "Most people shouldn't have to," I said. "But if you're ever in that position, don't back down just because they have lawyers and authority. Document everything, get good legal advice, and stand your ground if you're in the right." They assured me they'd remember that advice. I hoped they'd never need it, but knowing my luck and the nature of HOAs, someone in Oakmont Hills would eventually face another conflict. At least now there were better rules in place and a cautionary tale about what happened when boards overreached. Moving to Texas meant starting over in a lot of ways, but it also meant perspective on what I'd been through. From a distance, with time to process, I could see how the lawsuit had changed me. I was more confident in my ability to navigate complex systems, more willing to challenge authority when necessary, more aware of my rights and how to protect them. Those weren't skills I'd wanted to learn exactly. I would have preferred to never have my septic system destroyed in the first place. But given that it had happened, at least I'd turned the disaster into something constructive. That counted for something. My new house in Austin had no HOA, which felt wonderfully liberating. I could paint my front door purple if I wanted, install a tacky lawn ornament, let my grass grow shaggy. Not that I wanted to do any of those things, but the freedom was intoxicating. Nobody was going to find me or send nasty letters or dig up my yard without permission. But I also recognized that HOAs served legitimate purposes in some communities. They maintained common areas that individual homeowners couldn't manage alone. They provided a framework for resolving disputes. They preserved property values through reasonable standards. The problem wasn't the concept of HOAs, it was the execution, specifically when boards forgot they were servants of the community rather than rulers of it. That was the lesson Sharon Mitchell had never learned, and it had cost her and the HOA dearly. Power without accountability inevitably led to abuse, whether in government, corporations, or neighborhood associations. The only difference was the scale. 5 years after the settlement, I got a Facebook message from Richard Kowalski. He was still HOA president in Oakmont Hills and wanted to update me on how things were going. "The bylaws you forced us to adopt have made a huge difference," he wrote. "We've had 0 lawsuits since your case, and the homeowner satisfaction is way up according to our annual surveys. People actually trust the board now, which makes everything easier. I wanted to thank you for pushing for those changes even though it was expensive and difficult. You made this a better place to live." That message meant more to me than the settlement check ever had. Vindication wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or recovering damages. It was about creating lasting change that helped people who'd never know your name or understand what you'd sacrificed. I wrote back thanking him for the update and for his leadership. "You did the hard work of implementing the changes and proving they could work. I just created the circumstances that made them necessary. The credit goes to you." He insisted we shared it, that neither the lawsuit nor the reforms would have meant anything without both components. He was probably right. Systems changed through pressure and leadership working together, disruption from outside and commitment from inside. Looking back now, from the comfortable distance of time and geography, I can see the whole arc of the experience. The shock and anger of watching my septic system get destroyed, the frustration of dealing with Sharon's dismissive arrogance, the stress of litigation and the uncertainty of whether I'd win, the satisfaction of settlement and the gradual healing of my property and the community. It was exhausting while it was happening, draining in ways I couldn't fully articulate to friends and family who'd never dealt with HOA conflicts. How do you explain to someone that a neighborhood organization has the power to make your life hell, that volunteer board members can cost you tens of thousands of dollars through negligence or spite, that fighting back requires resources most people don't have? You can't, really. It's one of those situations where experience is the only teacher. You have to live through it to understand the unique combination of powerlessness and rage that comes from having your property rights trampled by people who claim to be acting in your best interest. But you can share the story, document the process, leave breadcrumbs for the next person who finds themselves in a similar situation. That was what my blog had been about, what the testimony to lawmakers had been about, what telling the new homeowners at closing had been about. Creating a record so others wouldn't have to figure everything out from scratch. I never heard what happened to Sharon Mitchell after she left Oakmont Hills. Whether she learned anything from the experience, whether she continued to abuse her authority in new contexts, whether she ever reflected on the damage her arrogance had caused. Part of me hoped she'd had some kind of realization, that she'd become a better person and leader. But honestly, I doubted it. People who'd spent years wielding petty power rarely gave it up willingly or learned humility from being checked. More likely, she'd found another HOA board somewhere, convinced herself that Oakmont Hills had been full of unreasonable people, and continued her pattern of behavior until she ran into another homeowner willing to fight back. That was how these cycles usually worked, abusers moving from situation to situation until consequences finally caught up. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd done what I could within my sphere of influence. The rest was up to other homeowners in other neighborhoods fighting their own battles. The septic system in my Austin house worked perfectly, a fact I appreciated every single day, even though most people took such things for granted. Clean water in, wastewater out, all happening invisibly underground without backup or flood, or any of the nightmare scenarios I'd lived through in Georgia. It was mundane infrastructure that only became visible when it failed. Kind of like HOA governance, actually. When it worked properly, you barely noticed it. Common areas stayed maintained, rules were applied fairly, disputes were resolved quietly. But when it failed, when boards overreached or cut corners or forgot who they served, the consequences could be catastrophic. I'd been unlucky enough to experience catastrophic failure, but fortunate enough to have the resources and determination to fight back. That combination was rare, which was why HOA abuse continued to be such a widespread problem. Most victims either lacked the resources to fight or the knowledge that fighting was even possible. Education was the key. spreading information about homeowner rights and the legal tools available to protect them. Every person who read my blog and successfully challenged an unfair HOA decision was a small victory against a system weighted toward organizational power over individual rights. The reforms I'd advocated for in Georgia never passed, killed in committee by legislators more concerned about property rights, meaning HOA rights rather than homeowner rights. It was disappointing, but not surprising. Structural change was hard, requiring sustained pressure over years or decades. My few hours of testimony weren't going to revolutionize HOA law, but individual cases could still matter. Each lawsuit that succeeded set precedent, created case law that future attorneys could cite, demonstrated that HOAs weren't invincible. The legal landscape shifted slowly, pushed by hundreds of small conflicts rather than sweeping legislative reforms. My contribution had been one of those pushes, adding momentum to a movement much larger than myself. Whether it would eventually result in meaningful change was impossible to say, but at least I'd tried. At least I'd left things slightly better than I'd found them. That was really all anyone could do. Fight the battles in front of you, document what you learned, share it with others who might need it. Hope that enough individual actions accumulated into collective progress, even if you never saw the final result. 10 years after the settlement, I received an email from a law student at Emory University. She was writing a paper on HOA disputes and wanted to interview me about my case, which had apparently become something of a teaching example in property law classes. "Your case is cited in textbooks now," she told me during our video call. "It's used to illustrate both the limits of HOA authority and the importance of following procedural requirements in governing documents. Professors use it to show students how seemingly small violations can lead to major liability." That was surreal to think about, that my destroyed septic system had become an academic case study, but also satisfying in a way I hadn't anticipated. If law students were learning about proper HOA procedure through my experience, maybe future lawyers would be better equipped to advise boards or represent aggrieved homeowners. "What's the main lesson you took from the experience?" the student asked. I thought about that for a moment, that institutions are only as good as the people running them and the rules that constrain them. HOAs can be beneficial when they're properly managed with respect for homeowner rights, but without strong safeguards, they can become instruments of petty tyranny. My case proved that those safeguards matter and that they're enforceable if you're willing to fight. She scribbled notes furiously. "Do you think HOAs should exist at all?" That's above my pay grade. I think they're a reality of modern suburban development, whether we like them or not. The question isn't whether HOAs should exist. It's how to make them function fairly when they do. Better bylaws, more transparency, easier access to dispute resolution, actual consequences for boards that overstep. Those are achievable goals that would prevent a lot of the nightmare scenarios people face. The interview lasted an hour, covering details I hadn't thought about in years. When it was over, I felt a strange sense of closure, like my experience had finally been processed and packaged into something useful for future generations. Maybe that was the real ending to the story, not the settlement check or Sharon's removal or even the bylaw reforms. The real ending was the transformation of personal trauma into collective knowledge, ensuring that the next person facing a destroyed septic system wouldn't have to figure everything out alone. Justice wasn't just about winning your case or recovering damages. It was about changing the system so fewer people needed justice in the first place. My lawsuit had been about $45,000, but it had become about so much more, about accountability and respect and the ongoing struggle to make power answerable to the people it affected. That struggle never truly ended, of course. There would always be new Sharon Mitchells, new HOA boards that thought themselves above the rules, new homeowners who needed to learn how to fight back. But each victory made the next one slightly easier. Each precedent strengthened the foundation for future cases. Each shared story provided a roadmap through the chaos. I'd started my journey watching a backhoe tear through my yard, feeling helpless and angry and overwhelmed. I'd ended it as someone who'd proven that homeowners weren't powerless, that HOAs could be held accountable, that justice was possible if you were willing to work for it. That transformation, from victim to victor to educator, was worth every moment of stress and every dollar spent on legal fees. It had given my experience meaning beyond personal vindication, turned private suffering into public good. And somewhere out there, someone was probably reading my blog right now, dealing with their own HOA nightmare, finding hope in the fact that I'd fought and won. That person would take what I'd learned, adapt it to their situation, and maybe win their own battle. Then they'd share their story, and the cycle would continue. That was how change happened. One destroyed septic system at a time.